Entwined is a podcast about how so much of the world around us is wound or twisted together. This podcast strives to bear unexposed or indiscernible connections using historical and anecdotal sources. I am P.S. McKay, and along with Elliot Gladstone, this is Entwined. I had the opportunity to walk through the woods of the Pacific Northwest very recently. Much of it brought me back to my roots in New England. The smells, the sounds, heck, even the freeways looked the same when traveling with the walls of trees around you. But there was something markedly different that struck me. The green was ever present. It was the greenest of all greens I'd ever seen. Now, given that it rains 9 months out of the year, I can understand the mechanics of why. Yet, it is another to be able to see what that effect the rain truly brings out. Walking through those branches, I saw the thickness of the foliage, and supporting that were the branches, which also had something growing on them. The moss was ever present, taking advantage of the extra growth space, anything to be able to get room to grow under the dispersed sunlight, and with it the lichen, growing in and around the moss. I felt, for lack of a better term, a cancer of life, continually growing, fighting to be on top, trying to get the upper hand, to get the precious commodity of sunlight, fueled by the overabundance of the life-giving water. Whatever happened, life was growing on top of itself, and I wondered what secrets were held in the layers beneath it. Whatever was there was easy to get lost. The trees and moss are quick there, and if you're not careful, you can lose track of the true roots of what held everything up in the first place. I'm not a big conspiracy guy. I think that the vast majority of conspiracy theories are perpetuated by people who want extra clicks on their website, views on Instagram, and ratings on their radio show. But I don't think those people truly believe in the conspiracies they repeat with abated breath, insisting that the US government is responsible for the serious lack of hurricanes that would appear in the Gulf of Mexico between 2005 and 2008. But there is an audience for it, and they eat it up almost as fast as those plants do the water in Seattle. I think it has to do with the endless need for people to create meaning in an otherwise senseless act. I'm a New England kid, and growing up in New England, John F. Kennedy was revered as the second coming. Blasphemy used for intentional effect. Listen, Kennedy was not a nice man. He was thoughtful and calculating, like any other politician, and it's clear that his policies were not that much different from Nixon's during the 1960 elections. Yeah, I was surprised to hear that too, but if you don't believe me, just check out CNN's The 60s, and that specific episode will confirm what I just said. My point, while he was not much different from his later infamous adversary, he was widely regarded as one of the greatest presidents in US history, whose life was cut far too short, far too soon. I remember at the young age of 9 in the late 80s, more than 25 years after his passing, people were still calling into radio stations asking how we could get someone like him back, another Kennedy, to continue Jackie's legacy. He had that much of an indelible impact on our nation's psyche, especially in his hometown of Massachusetts. No surprise there. And human nature, as in this case, tried to search for meaning behind Jackie's assassination. It couldn't make sense. He was just previously the hero averting World War III by deftly staring down the Soviet bear trying to make a land claim on land less than 90 miles from our shores. And the bear blinked, running back across the ocean. He was ushering in a new era of civil rights that would later change the way we use constitutional law. He was obviously on the side of good, and yet he was senselessly gunned down on one temperate November afternoon in the streets of Dallas while driving by an unfortunate book repository. People needed an answer. The idea that some crazy guy did it from said repository was just too simple. No way the feds could find a man like him so fast in a movie theater. It had to be a scapegoat to cover what really happened. The bullet injuries were at such odd angles that there had to be two gunmen from different locations. Maybe Jackie Boy knew too much. Maybe he uncovered the deep underbelly of a shadow U.S. government. Maybe knowing so much about that shadow program, the aliens, the interstellar negotiations, he had to be eliminated because such a good man would feel the need to tell the truth to the American people. Yeah, that makes people feel better. A good public servant wasn't needlessly killed. He was eliminated because of a higher purpose. The reason why I am skeptical of conspiracies is because while conspiracy theorists are operating on the skeptical spectrum, they operate under the auspicions of an ideology. They have a faith that needs to have so many people operate together, in tandem, and in secret to keep the truth away from the common public. And because of that belief in human behavior, there is only one answer. That is conspiracy. I don't have that same faith in humanity. People don't have that hard, fast devotion, especially when numbers are involved. Listen, there is a reason why millions of posters were printed that said "loose lips sank ships" during World War II. And by that notion, the more people you involve in a conspiracy, the higher likelihood that conspiracy will fail. You have anonymity in numbers, and more people will have a less likelihood of being held accountable when someone in that circle leaks information. And then there's Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the most likely one. Lee Harvey Oswald was a troubled man. Following a stint in the U.S. Marines, he attempted to defect to the Soviet Union in 1959. The official tourist there looked at him oddly and asked why would he want to do that. Even upon describing what his vision of a great Soviet Union should be to other Russian officials, he was met with skepticism and incomprehensibility. On the last day his visa was to expire, the Soviet Union rejected his application of citizenship. Distraught, he attempted to kill himself in his hotel bathroom by slitting his wrist. He was found by his tour guide before any harm came upon him. But even in the Soviet Union, he was found to be so unstable, he was placed in psychiatric care there prior to him leaving. He repeatedly met with Soviet officials and doctors expressing his desire to join the Union, and he was met with denial. Upon discharging, he appeared before the U.S. Embassy in Moscow saying he was renouncing his citizenship. This was a sign of mental illness, and while there were rude definitions of it in the 60s, we are only now beginning to truly accept that when someone is truly mentally ill, that nothing makes sense as to what they do. I almost wanted to say that the reason he assassinated the president was because he was the true symbol of America, to which he hated. But I can't say that. Lee Harvey Oswald has no answers to his actions, because he had no control over his actions. And that mysterious magic bullet, the one that went through Jackie's throat, and then several degrees and hit his wrist, another few degrees into the back of a person sitting in the front passenger seat, the one that everyone insisted there was a second shooter because a single bullet couldn't perform that way. Well, it can, because it never changed direction. Jackie Kennedy was sitting in the back seat on an elevated cushion, placing him head and shoulders above the people in the front row seats. So a bullet would go through the president's throat, hitting his wrist in front of him, and into the back of the front passenger from the book depository. And it's all in the official FBI report. If you think that there is no way that report could tell the truth, well, I want to point out there were numerous different agencies involved in the investigation. And remember, the more agencies, the more people involved. The more people involved creates more anonymity. Loose lips sink ships. And yet not one of any credible source has come forward to dispute the official finding. Remember, the simplest explanation, no matter how hard it is to make sense, to justify, is most likely the actual truth of the matter. And the Loch Ness Monster, I'm sorry, not real either. Let me just explain some biological reasoning here. A modern African elephant will require 200 to 600 pounds of food a day, and they're just 12 feet high and weigh 6 to 7 tons. A plesiosaur, Their lengths have been described as being as long as 51 feet or 17 meters for the European listening audience. It is significantly larger than the largest mammal on Earth, and one can be conservative and say they would require maybe 2 times the amount of food. Maybe 3? Probably a lot more, though. And if you buy into the idea that there were a mix between hot and cold-blooded, but the loch doesn't have enough fish to furnish that kind of animal. A single landlocked lake with the only incoming population coming from humans would not be enough to sustain such an animal. But we believe, because who doesn't want to think there are dinosaur-style-like animals still in existence? Heck, the coelacanth still exists, and that fish was thought to have died out 100 million years ago, until it was found. We're trying to place an order into events that to the normal human mind, they can't compute it. And sometimes humans, being the creative species that we are, make things more complicated than they have to be. What I found so exciting about the Northwest was that it was simply a pivot point in the nation's history. This small area, traditionally very isolated from the rest of the country, is responsible for some of our culture's greatest changes. The reason we have Seattle, Oregon, and consequently California, Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, and essentially the entire West is because of the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon, having recently recovered the territory from Spain, realized that he needed funds in the prospect of war against the United Kingdom. In what would cost in present $250 million, the U.S. took the bargain originally, only wanting the port of New Orleans. Fun fact, the Federalist Party opposed the purchase, telling President Jefferson that the Constitution did not allow for the purchase or acquisition of new territory. Here's what's fun about our Constitution, whether you love it or hate it. Jefferson interpreted that the constitutional power bestowed upon him to make foreign treaties thereby encapsulated the ability to make the decision on the acquisition of new territory. Neat, huh? The Constitution is so vague that our entire nation is based on interpretations of vague wording and hastily set precedent on it. Perhaps that is the uniqueness of the American psyche, but I digress. Of course, you all know that Jefferson commissioned an exploration helmed by Lewis and Clark. And while I won't go into too many details about it, I will add a couple interesting tidbits. Traveling through the northern country, Lewis wrote of how weary he was dealing with the grizzly bear. They are apex of the food chain and easy to startle since they have no natural predators to be mindful of, and they were extremely hard to kill. He dreaded the thought of how many there were in their path. Back then, the grizzly population went all the way south to being just outside of San Francisco until the very late 1800s. And as the expedition was preparing to cross the Rockies, they were in need of 40 horses to make sure their cross was safe and successful. They were in negotiations with a nearby tribe, but it was going nowhere. That was until Sacagawea, their Native American guide, spoke with the tribal chief and discovered that he was a long-lost brother of hers. Small world. And yes, the expedition was extraordinarily successful. For the first time, it planted into the minds of Americans that their country could be a true bicoastal nation, a manifest destiny that would take root over the course of the next 4 decades. Yet it is after the trip that I want to focus on. You see, the trip changed Lewis. He was awarded for his expedition efforts by being given 1,600 acres of land and an appointment as governor to the Louisiana Territory. His tenure during that time was mixed. He was tasked with completing and publishing the core of discovery journals, but had difficulty completing his writings. While he was able to broker several peace agreements with local tribes, his attempts at preventing settlers from encroaching on their lands was less than successful. The trip through the territories opened the floodgates of pioneers through St. Louis into the northern woods. He also had to deal with a rival by the name of Frederick Bates, who was accused of undermining Lewis and trying to get him dismissed as governor, and to take the role himself. Washington, due to the slow mail system, had the impression that they were not being adequately kept in touch with the goings-on and what was going on in the territory. Most damning, though, was a letter from Bates to Washington that accused Lewis of profiting from a mission to return a Mandan chief to his tribe. The War Department, who had an agreement for reimbursing Lewis for his finances due to the Northwest expedition, decided that they would withhold the reimbursement. This caused a chain reaction that created Lewis's creditors to panic and call on his notes, forcing him to liquidate his assets, including the land rewarded to him after the expedition. It was a very trying time for Lewis, and it took a toll on him. Not seeing any other opportunity, he set out to Washington to set the record straight. His intentions were to take the Mississippi River route, but inexplicably, he got out and set course on the Natchez Trail in Mississippi that would take him east through Nashville to Washington. But this was a perilous journey, wrought with highway robbers up and down that way, robbers who would routinely kill their victims. On October 10th of 1809, Lewis checked into an inn called the Grinder's Stand, about 70 miles southwest of Nashville. After dinner, he retired to his room. In the pre-dawn hours of the next morning, gunshots were heard. Servants found Lewis with wounds to the gut and head, badly bleeding out. As his blood stained the buffalo hide robe he wore, Meriwether Lewis died shortly after sunrise at the age of 35. The money that the War Department owed him, the entire reason for the trip to appeal the decision to withhold the reimbursement, that was finally reimbursed to him 2 years later. Now, the official ruling on his death was suicide, but there were many questions left in the overall circumstances of his death. Several accounts said that when he was found in his room, his throat was slashed, and money he borrowed to complete the journey was missing. Mrs. Grinder, the innkeeper's wife, was the one to allege hearing the gunshots in the first place. She gave 3 non-written and inconsistent accounts to the incident leading up to the badly injured Lewis. The first was him acting strangely the night before his death, pacing and talking to himself after heading to his room. She, at some point, heard gunshots, a scuffle, someone calling out for help. She claimed to be able to see Lewis crawl back into his room through the slit in her door, but she never investigated further. Only the next morning did she send her children to have Lewis's servants check on him. A second account states that Lewis was found in his room the next morning, wounded and bloody, with part of his skull bore. Very different from the official determination of cause of death, no? And yet, Mrs. Grinder, who seems to be the most central figure of accounts for some reason, gives yet another account where 3 men followed Lewis that fateful night up the trail, where Lewis challenged them to a duel. Hearing voices coming from his room and gunshots, she found his cabin to be empty with a large amount of gunpowder on the floor. And in this circumstance, Lewis's body was found outside his cabin. So the official finding was still Lewis had committed suicide, but when given so many different circumstances, wouldn't it give you pause? If he was your son, your husband, would you not want to have the authorities look into this a little deeper? To rule what could very well be a murder case? He was, after all, in a place known for robberies and murder. In fact, his mother went to her grave insisting he was murdered in his cabin. Repeated requests from his descendants to have the body medically examined have been denied by the U.S. Department of Interior. Considering that his grave rests in a national monument, it was frustrating. Considering that the only official medical exam done on his body was a full 40 years after his death. Could there be a true conspiracy to hide the fact that one of the most influential changers of our nation's destiny was in fact murdered in cold blood? Perhaps it was a government order to prevent the reimbursement off the expedition expense. Was it a hit job by Bates to ensure he managed to get power as governor of the Louisiana Territories? Surely the truth needed to be uncovered somehow. But it seems that the passage of time was his enemy and would work to cover what really happened. Under the cover of the green trees, an electrician by the name of Gary Smith arrived at a home on Lake Washington Boulevard in Seattle. This was in the mid-90s, and his task was simple. He was to install a security system in the red brick home of this quiet neighborhood. The job turned into a nightmare when Gary came across the body of a man laying in one of the rooms. There was a minor amount of blood coming from his ear, but there was no discernible signs of trauma that were visible. That is until he saw the shotgun pointing at the man's chin. It became apparent at that moment that this man most likely took his life. And poor Gary Smith was witness to the end of a revolution that was taking place in the Seattle area. A revolution that this man started in response to the glam rock of the 80s, a counterculture that he was a symbol of. Kurt Cobain, the founder of Nirvana and the grunge movement, died on April 8, 1994. Along with his death crashed the hearts of millions who found their voice through his songs that ran counter to what the culture was trying to push upon them. Through Kurt, people found a sullen truth that it was okay to be a little different. And for someone so beloved and followed, it didn't make sense that someone would commit suicide while at the top of their career. Theories abounded as the true nature of his passing. The suicide note that was found with him had lines in it that didn't match his handwriting. The note initially read sounded more like a goodbye note rather than a suicide note. Surely his wife, Courtney Love, with whom he had a very up and down relationship, was the cause of this. Maybe he was trying to leave her, and in a fit of rage she shot him, then changed the Dear John note to a suicide note. There's a documentary that explores Love hiring a man by the name of El Deuce, or El Duce. I don't know. But it is an odd name. Nevertheless, this odd-named individual was hired to take out Cobain. He alleges that he was offered $50,000 to do it. Strangely enough, 2 days after his interview, El Deuce was hit and killed by a train. In the end, the truth is just much more sobering. Cobain came from a broken home. He experimented with drugs at the age of 13. His youth was mired in conflict and depression. Shortly before graduation, he found out he didn't have enough credits to graduate high school and dropped out. His mother, giving him the ultimatum to find work or leave, later threw him out of her house. His fame was an overwhelming entity, and he had a hard time coping with that notoriety and the challenges of celebrity. Notably, the irony that his counterculture music was welcomed as mainstream. It kind of loses a certain meaning when that happens. And the week leading to his death, he escaped rehab after numerous incidents of radical behavior. He flew back to Seattle that night, next to Duff McKagan of Guns N' Roses. Per McKagan, Cobain seemed happy, but there was definitely something wrong with him. During this time, friends and family were unaware of his whereabouts. Cobain, one can assume, probably slipped into a deeper moment with his demons, all of it being too much to handle, and Kurt Cobain, the definition of an entire generation, simply couldn't bear the pain anymore. As for Meriwether Lewis, well, those were tantalizing theories, and they would certainly paint the death as more meaningful than a suicide. But just like Cobain, Lewis was in a very troubled state. His finances were in ruins, his superiors had serious doubt in his governing abilities, his rival was trying desperately to sully his reputation. And one more fact. Upon disembarking from the Mississippi River to travel the Natchez Trail, Lewis was recorded using heavy amounts of opiates and alcohol. To which point, he in fact tried to commit suicide prior to reaching the inn. It was through his travel partners that he was restrained and continued on to the trip. There is no meaning in some circumstances, and that is a terrifying prospect to the human mind, which is always looking for order and reason. While the Pacific Northwest may give off the sense of hidden treasure and memories all hidden under that growth, sometimes one has to simply step back and see the forest for what it is. Simply trees. For what you see, in most circumstances, is really what you get. Thank you for listening. Entwined is a podcast that releases every other week, and is written, recorded, and produced by P.S. McKay and Elliot Gladstone. This episode was written by P.S. McKay. Please tune in next time to see what Elliot Gladstone has in store for us. For more information about the show and the authors, please check out entwinedpodcast.com, or visit our Twitter page @entwinedpodcast.